All right, well, what does alcohol do? How does it work? Well, it has a little bit of a double punch in our system in that it mediates the firing and the signals associated with two really big neurotransmitter systems. They are the Gaba and glutamate systems. What each of these systems do is general inhibition and excitation. GABA is our main inhibitory neurotransmitter, so it turns things off. Glutamate is our main excitatory neurotransmitter. It helps turn things on. Generally, we think of alcohol as a GABA drug, but it also affects glutamate. But let's start with GABA really quickly. GABA is gamma aminobutyric acid, and if we look at this this neuron over here, and say it's a GABA neuron, if it contains GABA in its little vesicles, whenever GABA is released into this synaptic cleft and then binds with its receptor on the postsynaptic neuron, when GABA binds, it allows the influx of negatively charged ions into the postsynaptic cell. It mainly drives the movement of chloride, which is a negatively charged ion, into the postsynaptic neuron. And in order for signals to go on, we need to have this first neuron turn on the second neuron. In the GABA system, because it's inhibitory and lets in negative ions, it doesn't turn on that second neuron. Instead, it turns it off. It hyperpolarizes it. It makes its charge really low. The lower the charges of a neuron, the less likely it is to do something, to have an action potential. So essentially, GABA quiets down the system. Conversely, glutamate turns on the system. And when I say the system, I mean everything else in the brain. Dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, GABA, and glutamate are what turn these systems on or off. GABA's your off one. Glutamate is your on one. So if this now is a glutamate neuron, it would contain glutamate in its vesicles, and whenever glutamate is released from the vesicle into the synaptic cleft, it binds to its receptors called NMDA receptors, NMDAR, R for receptors. And when glutamate binds to its receptor, it allows the influx of positively charged ions, like sodium, for example. This, because it's a positive charge, it's going to drive up the charge of this second neuron so that it's going to do things. So this neuron 1 will turn on neuron 2 so that it can continue signaling to neuron 3, 4, 5, up to a billion. So glutamate turns on your body systems in your brain, and GABA turns off systems. So in the most simplistic sense, then, we would say that alcohol increases GABA conduction and it decreases glutamate conduction. So increases GABA, decreases glutamate. So it increases inhibition and decreases excitation. What that means is we're going to have a lot of hyperpolarized or excessively negatively charged neurons in the brain. GABA drugs in general are going to lead to low neuronal firing, low neuronal activity. They dampen things. Other types of GABA drugs include benzodiazepines. One thing I want you to remember forever and always about GABA drugs is that it's really difficult for somebody to just stop taking them. Alcohol and benzodiazepine withdrawal are the two things that can actually kill somebody when we talk about drug withdrawal. So it's a really large system, and it's very dangerous to mess around with it, and we have to slowly wean people off of those things and not go into immediate withdrawal. When you don't have a lot of GABA activity, you get the opposite, and you get seizure activity, which is why we see seizures with alcohol withdrawal syndrome. So, what we're seeing with alcohol in its acute effects are the hyperpolarizing effects of increased GABA and decreased glutamate, really working in this interesting type of way, hyperpolarizing neurons depending upon dose. So, first, let me just explain to you what I mean by dose. And to understand that, we need to understand what I mean by a drink. So, when we're thinking about what alcohol does, we first have to define what we mean by a drink. And the drink will tell us our dose of alcohol. In the United States, we have standard drink sizes. And these are important to know because most people are very off when they're estimating how much they had to drink because they don't know drink sizes. So we would consider one drink to be equal to 12 ounces of 5% ABV is alcohol by volume beer. So that would be anything that is commercially made and distributed. So like your Budweiser, your Miller, anything that's in a can and sold. So those things have to be 5% alcohol by volume, and they're in a 12-ounce amount. That's important to distinguish because when you go out to a bar and get a pint, that's actually 16 ounces. So that's more than a standard drink. And then if that's not commercially produced in a large factory and it's microbrewed in a smaller facility, they're no longer bound by the 5% limit. They can make really high percent alcohol beers, which means already you're probably drinking 16 ounces of that beer, and it's probably a lot higher than 5%. So people can consume a lot more than they think. With malt liquors, which includes anything that's in like a 40 ounce, but also a lot of the Alco Pops, those are malt liquors. And an Alco Pop would be like a Four Loko or one of those mixed can drinks. Those have a large amount of alcohol in them generally, and it's usually 7% alcohol by volume, and 8 ounces of a malt liquor, which is about a cup, that would be one drink. With wine, it's 5 ounces. And if you're looking at a standard bottle, the way that they sell wine glasses now in those big balloon glasses, you can get usually, 2 glasses out of a bottle of wine. Technically, there's 5 to 6 servings of wine in each bottle. 5 ounces in a wine glass is a very small amount of wine, but that's 12% alcohol by volume, and we would consider 5 ounces one drink. 1.5 ounces, that's the amount in a standard shot glass. That would be of an 80 proof liquor, meaning that it's 40% alcohol by volume. Whatever the proof is, if you take that number in half, that's what percent alcohol it is. So there are drinks that are 140 proof, 100 proof. So those have a large amount of alcohol in them. And the more somebody ingests of an alcohol, they will get different effects. One thing I just want to draw your attention to is that alcohol, by definition, is a little bit different than other substances in that in lower doses, it's actually characterized as a stimulant. And the reason for that is alcohol is a vasodilator. So when you drink it, your vessels get really big. That's why you see flushing with alcohol. But when your blood vessels dilate, that means your blood pressure is going to start to drop, and your body doesn't like to be off homeostasis. So if your vessels get really big and your blood pressure starts to drop, it means your heart's going to have to beat a lot faster. When your heart beats fast, it feels good. So it's a stimulant type of action physiologically. The heart rate goes up so that our blood pressure stays stable. So when somebody ingests a small amount of alcohol and their heart rate goes up and their rates of physiologic activity go up, it's a stimulant type of feeling. Once you get over about a 0.05, which is about 2 drinks, let's say, then we start to go from stimulant into sedative characterization of that drug, where rather than having these euphoric, buzzed types of feelings, you start to feel kind of tired and things in the brain start to slow down. So this is an interesting thing. We call it the biphasic effects of alcohol. And as long as there's no caffeine in that person's drink, then they generally follow this pattern of intoxication, where at low doses they feel relatively stimulated, and then at higher doses they start to feel kind of tired. And that's an important thing in intoxication. Once somebody starts to feel tired, they want to go home. They want to stop drinking. They want to go to sleep. Unfortunately, when you start to mix caffeine in with that, instead of starting to get sedated, you just become more and more stimulated. Even though you have a high breath alcohol level, you don't feel intoxicated, so people are way more likely to drive or engage in other activities without fully feeling intoxicated. If there is no caffeine in that drink, or those drinks, we'll follow this pretty standard level of alcohol effects. In that biphasic way, we'll start to see these very predictable types of psychological and physical effects. And I love this because it really is anatomical in nature. We start to see this hyperpolarization occur in brain structures, really from the front of the brain into these deeper levels of the brain that are more important to functioning. So when somebody has a small amount of alcohol and their blood alcohol level is about 0.01% or lower, there's really no effects. But once they start to get up to one drink, maybe 1.5, 2 drinks, we start to see that they're feeling kind of good. They're warm because they're vasodilating. But when we have these low doses of alcohol, they're hyperpolarizing neurons, mainly in our frontal areas of the brain, our prefrontal cortex. And that's the area that is going to be in control of your judgment, but that's also what inhibits your behavior throughout the day, so that you don't interrupt people or take their stuff or, just start talking in situations or dancing. When we start to turn off those neurons by hyperpolarizing them, we lose some of that social inhibition. So we talk more, we might dance, we might start laughing and having a good time. We feel kind of euphoric. So that is just the hyperpolarization of these frontal areas. But once the dose gets higher and we start to ingest more alcohol, this wave of hyperpolarization starts to make its way to other lobes of the brain that control things like movement, so with your muscles, motor planning, feeling different sensations, so that once we see people up to 3 to 4 drinks, they're not as alert. Their judgment isn't very good because this part of the brain is really offline at that point in time. And they start to lose some of their muscle control and their more fine movements. So if they're trying to play darts, maybe it's getting more difficult. Maybe it's difficult to undo their fly or turn a key. And that has to do with turning off neurons in those areas. Once you start to get up to pretty high levels of intoxication, so like this 0.14. So for males, that's 5 or 6 drinks. For females, that's about 4 to 5. Reaction time gets lower, muscle coordination goes down. We're also affecting these limbic areas in the center, so memory starts to be affected. Like, did we just talk about that? Like, where did we go? Where did I leave my keys? Difficulty focusing. The further back in the brain we go with higher doses, we start to see more and more motor effects, but also visual effects. So blurry vision, double vision, tunnel vision. It's difficult to walk, to stand or walk in a straight line, to stand up straight. People fall off of things. That's really looking at these back motor areas and eye areas. And also the cerebellum is balance. Once you get to these really high levels of alcohol intoxication, we're getting to the lowest levels in the brain. So places like the brainstem that have these facilitating areas for breathing are going to start to be affected. And when somebody has an overdose with alcohol, they die due to respiratory depression. So it's a really interesting anatomical component here that you can actually see neurons and brain areas going offline, starting with these front areas at low doses and then getting to these deeper, more important areas of the brain as doses increase. So we would say that the effects of alcohol acutely would be dependent upon how much is consumed and then what the dose is in the blood. And the dose that is in the blood is going to determine which area of the brains are affected. Whatever areas of the brain are affected are going to give us our output, give us our behaviors. The higher the dose, the more important behaviors are taken offline. As an addiction scientist, I do have to briefly talk about just reinforcement in alcohol. There will be a whole addiction and reinforcement talk on the channel, but just as a tie-up, alcohol is a reinforcing substance. It is reinforcing to animals and humans. It is more difficult to get animals to ingest alcohol because it does have an aversive taste. Humans were pretty good at reasoning our way out of things and ignoring the fact that it's an aversive substance, and we ingest it anyways. Whenever alcohol is ingested, it activates this reward pathway that we see activated in any rewarding circumstance. So the reward pathway is this really basic brain area that begins in this cell area called the ventral tegmental area. It is an area rich in dopaminergic neurons, and those dopaminergic neurons project to this close area called the nucleus accumbens. And whenever you do something that will keep you or your species alive, we get an activation of this pathway. So when you eat something, so we can actually see this graphed over here, thanks to the National Institute on Drug Abuse. When there is food that is presented and then ingested, there is some dopamine that is squirted from the VTA neurons onto receptors in the nucleus accumbens. And that dopamine is thought to reinforce that behavior. So you're going to want to eat again. So feeding, drinking, procreation, that keeps your species alive. So sex activates this reward pathway. The interesting thing about drugs of abuse is that when we look at how much dopamine is released in this pathway relative to natural reinforcers like food or sex, it's a lot higher than we would see with natural reinforcers. So dopamine is released at a higher rate in these areas with things like cocaine, morphine, amphetamine. What we see in the final graph here is ethanol. So with higher doses of ethanol, we have longer release of dopamine. But still the same basic amount of dopamine. The dose is really going to be what determines how long that dopamine is around for in the brain. So at the most simplistic level, we would say that things that excite this pathway are rewarding to that individual. And if something is rewarding to a brain, it wants to engage in that behavior again. So alcohol does activate this reward pathway. Another thing that is not labeled here, and I'll talk about more in other videos, are the opioid receptors around in this area. When the reward pathway is activated, that also is going to involve our endogenous opioid system. This is an interesting tie-in because when you give naltrexone to people who want to stop drinking, naltrexone is your Narcan. That's your antagonist for opiates. But it's also really useful in problematic drinking. So when you give somebody Vivitrol or Narcan, they no longer have the really euphoric effects along with their drinking. So if somebody was drinking for their euphoria and they're feeling really good, when you give this opiate antagonist along with it, they no longer experience the euphoria and then no longer associate those really good things with drinking. So it is a newer therapy for reducing alcohol consumption. All right, well, everybody, that was what I had to say about alcohol. I hope you learned something, and I hope you all stay smart. Thank you.